Now we can move on to the next simulation, which is how to draw these grooves in the ground. This can be done through a real displacement of the mesh. We'll use the dynamic paint effect to do this. This effect basically draws something on a surface, as the name suggests. It can change the color of the vertexes or really change the shape of the mesh. So, we have something that acts as a brush. In our case, it's the spaceship. And another object, in this case the ground, as the canvas. But we don't want to turn the whole ground into a canvas. In fact, consider that we want to displace the surface. This means we have to deform it in order to make the grooves. And to do that, we need a lot of faces. But we don't want to divide the whole ground into a lot of small pieces. So, the first step is to find the spot where the spaceship landed. And then split it up into many parts. Let's duplicate the ground. For the dynamic paint effect, we'll use just one object. The other one is for the collision effect for the building's pieces. It won't show up in the rendering. Let's choose the part of the ground we want to isolate. Enter Edit mode and choose the Bisect tool. Basically, I'm going to draw a rectangle that represents the part of the ground where the spaceship lands. Now, select the rectangle and press the P key to separate the object. We've got two objects: the rectangle and the original ground. Now I have to cut the rectangle into many smaller pieces. Enter the Edit mode and divide the mesh by pressing the right mouse button and selecting Subdivide. You can do the same thing over and over to add more subdivisions. This is the object to which we need to apply the dynamic paint effect from the Physical Properties section. This object needs to be the canvas, so we can leave the type property as it is. Then, add the canvas. Now we have to choose how the dynamic paint will be made. In our case, we chose Displace. Now we have to add the object that will really displace the surface. Let's add a sphere as a simple test. Set the dynamic paint effect to brush in this case. When we play the timeline and move the sphere, we can see the result in real time. As the sphere gets closer to the ground, it makes some grooves. We can also see why having lots of subdivisions is important. There are also some choices we can make to change the effect. We can set the number of frames in the simulation. And, as we saw with the simulations of rigid bodies, we can control the substeps property. As usual, this is especially important when we have objects that move quickly and require Blender to do more calculations for each frame. We can also modify the displace factor, that defines the displacement amount. We can also set the radius of the brush's effect on the canvas. Now, we need to apply the same effect on every part of the spaceship. Let's start with this one as an example. Add the brush and start the animation. But it appears that nothing happens when the object hits the ground. This is because we need the brush and the canvas to be close enough. If we take a look at the paint property of the brush, we have different way the brush can interact with the canvas. The default choice is Mesh. Proximity means that the brush can also paint the canvas from a certain distance away. But this doesn't work in the case of displacement. By adding a new object, like a sphere, and setting the canvas to paint mode, we can see how proximity works. Be aware that paint doesn't refer to materials, but to vertex paint. We can see this if we make a new vertex group in the output section of the canvas. This is the group of vertices that the brush will paint. Now, select the vertex color mode in the viewport shading panel. In this way, the viewport shows the color of the points. By playing the timeline and moving the sphere, you can now see it very clearly. Remember that you need to press the G key to move the object, not the arrows on the axis. In this situation, the brush is painting because it touches the canvas. But we can also move the sphere up. And we can also paint by choosing proximity in the paint menu and increasing the distance. But this only works in the paint mode, as was already said. So, if we want our spaceship to displace the ground, we have to make a copy of each part and make it bigger, so that it really interacts with the ground. So, I'm going to make a copy of this object, and only use it as a brush. In this case, you should make sure to turn off its rendering. I'm going to make it bigger now. But before you do that, you need to get rid of the scale keyframes that were made automatically when the animation was baked. I can now make it larger. If we play the animation, this object finally makes a groove in the ground. We can make a smaller or bigger groove by making this object bigger or smaller. We can now do the same thing with all the other objects. And this is what happened in the end. Before we move on, let's talk about the simulation's cache. We had a problem with rigid bodies, we couldn't save the simulation to disk. But we can do that in this case. We can bake the simulation and save it to disk from the cache panel. When we press the Bake button, the simulation is saved to a folder with the same name as your Blender file. Now, we can move to any point in the timeline, and the simulation is instantly updated. Here is a notice that tells us how many frames have been saved to disk. This is what happened in the end. I increased the resolution of the ground a lot. Here we have all the parts of the spaceship. The original objects and their copies that have been set to not be rendered.